To truly understand why the American Revolution was inevitable, you have to ignore the history books that start in 1776. You have to go back 13 years earlier to 1763. The atmosphere in the American colonies wasn't one of rebellion. It was one of absolute, roaring triumph. For 7 long, bloody years, the colonists had fought side by side with British redcoats in the French and Indian War. This wasn't just some distant skirmish. It was a brutal struggle for the very soul of the continent. Colonial farmers had left their plows to pick up muskets. They had watched their homes burn and their friends fall in the wilderness, all for one singular goal: to kick the French out of North America and open up the Golden West. And they did it. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, the French Empire in North America vanished overnight. The massive, fertile expanse of the Ohio River Valley, land of endless forests, rich soil, and untapped wealth was finally theirs. Or so they thought. Imagine the scene. Thousands of colonial veterans are returning home. They are exhausted, but they are dreaming of a future. In the 18th century, land was everything. Land was wealth. Land was the right to vote. Land was the ability to feed your children and build a legacy. To the crowded coastal cities of Boston and Philadelphia, the West was the promised land. But then, the news arrived from London. King George III, sitting in a palace 3,000 miles away, dipped his quill in ink and drew a single, jagged line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. He issued the Proclamation of 1763. With one stroke of a pen, he made it illegal for any colonists to settle west of that line. If you were already there, you had to leave. If you were planning to go, you were now a criminal. This wasn't just a policy change, it was a psychological earthquake. To the colonists, this felt like a betrayal of the highest order. But to King George and his advisors, it was simple math. Britain was the victor of the war, but they were a victor on the verge of bankruptcy. The national debt of Great Britain had nearly doubled during the fighting. They were drowning in red tape and interest payments. The king looked at the map of the Ohio River Valley and did not see opportunity. He saw expense. He knew that if thousands of colonists poured over those mountains, they would inevitably clash with the Native American tribes groups, like the Ottawa, the Wyandot, and the Shawnee, who were rightfully defending their ancestral homes. War with the tribes meant sending British soldiers. Soldiers meant supply lines. Supply lines meant money that Britain simply did not have. The proclamation line was essentially a do not disturb sign hung on the wilderness to keep the British budget from collapsing. The king wanted a quiet, manageable colony that stayed on the coast, where they could be easily taxed and policed. He wanted them in a cage. For your YouTube audience, this is where the story gets human. Think about the average colonial soldier. Let's call him John. John had spent 3 years fighting the French. He'd survived smallpox, starvation, and winter campaigns. He had been promised often by his own colonial government that his pay for the war would be a land grant in the West. Now, John is told that the land he bled for is off. Why? To protect the interests of the Crown's pocketbook. The anger wasn't just about the land itself, it was about the disrespect. For a century, the British had treated the colonists as partners in the empire. Suddenly, they were being treated like children who couldn't be trusted to walk into the woods. The proclamation line created a physical barrier, but it also created a mental one. For the first time, the colonists looked at the king and didn't see a protector, they saw a jailer. It wasn't just the poor farmers who were angry, the founding fathers. The elites were getting burned, too. Men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin were heavily invested in Western land companies. They had poured their personal fortunes into buying up land rights in the Ohio Valley, betting that the value would skyrocket after the war. When the king slammed the door shut, he didn't just hurt the poor. He wiped out the investments of the wealthiest, most influential men in America. You want to know why George Washington, a loyal British officer, eventually turned against the king? Follow the money. The Proclamation of 1763 turned the American dream of expansion into a British legal nightmare. To make matters worse, the British couldn't even enforce the line properly. While the king was telling the colonists to stay out, a massive uprising of Native American tribes, led by the Ottawa leader Pontiac, began attacking British forts. The British response was to send more redcoats, but they didn't send them to help the settlers. They sent them to enforce the proclamation. Imagine being a settler on the frontier, seeing a British soldier and realizing that soldier is you aren't there to protect you from an attackee. It's there to make sure you and build a barn on the wrong side of the mountain. The tension was suffocating. The colonists felt like they were being hemmed in against the sea. To the east was the Atlantic Ocean, and to the west was a line of British bayonets, telling them, thus far and no further. This is the real cause that the textbooks often skim over. Before the Stamp Act, before the Boston Massacre, and long before the Tea Party, there was the line. The Proclamation of 1763 taught the Americans a terrifying lesson. Their interest and the interests of the British Empire were no longer the same. For 150 years, they had been moving forward, growing and expanding. Now, for the first time in their history, they were being told to stop. The British thought they were bringing order to a chaotic frontier, but in reality, they were building a pressure cooker. By trying to save the empire from the cost of Western expansion, King George III planted the seeds of the empire's destruction. He didn't just draw a line on a map, he drew a line in the hearts of his subjects. On one side of that line was subjecthood, and on the other was independence. The colonists were now looking west, past the redcoats, past the mountains, and seeing a future that Britain was trying to steal from them. The revolution didn't start with a tax on a drink. It started with a hunger for the horizon. If the Proclamation of 1763 was a fence around the colonies, the end of salutary neglect was the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut. To understand why the American Revolution felt less like a rebellion and more like a war of you have to understand a term most history books bury in the fine print: salutary neglect. For over a century, the British Empire operated like a distant, wealthy father who was too busy at the office to check his son is a report card. From the mid-1600s to 1763, the British government basically left the American colonies alone. This wasn't because they were nice. It was because the colonies were 3,000 miles away, separated by a dangerous 2-month journey across the Atlantic. This period of ghost governance allowed something remarkable to happen. The Americans grew up. They built their own roads, founded their own colleges, created their own courts, and most importantly, governed themselves through their own elected assemblies. They had become, in every sense but name, an independent people. Then, in the 1760s, the ghost decided to materialize, and he came back with a grudge. Imagine you've lived in a house for 20 years. You've fixed the roof, painted the walls, and paid for the upkeep. Then, one morning, a landlord you've never met walks through the front door, puts his boots on your coffee table, and tells you that from now on, he's deciding what you eat for dinner and what time you turn out the lights. That is exactly how the colonists felt when Britain ended salutary neglect. The 7 Years' War had left Britain with a staggering debt the equivalent of trillions of dollars today. Tupai Itof, the British Parliament looked across the ocean and saw 13 thriving colonies that had been skating by without paying their fair share of imperial taxes. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about authority. The British leadership, particularly men like George Grenville, believed the colonies had become too brazen. They decided it was time to remind the Americans who was the master and who was the servant. Before this shift, if a town in Massachusetts needed a new bridge, the local town meeting voted on it, raised the funds, and built it. If a merchant in Virginia had a legal dispute, it was settled by a jury of his peers in a local court. This was the American way. But as Britain tightened its grip, they began to bypass these local institutions. They started enforcing the writs of assistance. These were essentially blanket search warrants that allowed British customs officers to enter any home, any warehouse, and any ship at any time without a specific reason. No probable cause, no judge's signature, just raw imperial power. Think about the psychological impact of that. Your home, which for generations had been your castle, was now open territory for any British official who felt like snooping through your private papers. The right to privacy wasn't a constitutional amendment yet, but the feeling of it was already deep in the American DNA. By ignoring local laws, Britain was telling the colonists, your local governments are just we are the only real power here. The most visible sign that the ghost had returned was the sudden appearance of the redcoats. During the war against the French, the British soldiers were seen as allies. But after the war ended, the soldiers didn't leave. In 1765, Parliament passed the Quartering Act. This law didn't just keep soldiers in America. It forced the colonists to pay for their housing and food. If there wasn't enough room in the barracks, soldiers were moved into public houses, barns, and uninhabited buildings. Imagine walking down the street of your quiet town and seeing thousands of armed men in bright red uniforms patrolling the corners. They weren't there to protect the colonists from an enemy. The French were gone. They were there to enforce the new taxes and keep the rabble in line. This was a standing army in peacetime, something English law itself traditionally loathed. The friction was constant. These soldiers were often young, poorly paid, and bored. They competed with local laborers for part-time jobs, driving down wages. They flirted with local women. They got into brawls in taverns. The tension was a ticking time bomb. The Boston Massacre didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the inevitable result of years of living under a military occupation that the people never asked for and were unallowed to vote against. Perhaps the most under-the-radar cause of the revolution was the change in the legal system. For a century, if a colonist was accused of smuggling, which was basically the national pastime, they were tried in a local court with a local jury. Naturally, American juries almost never convicted American smugglers. They saw smuggling not as a crime, but as a way to survive British trade restrictions. To fix this, Britain moved these trials to viceadmiralty courts. These were different for two terrifying reasons. One, there was no jury. A single judge, appointed by the crown, decided your fate. Two, you were essentially guilty until proven innocent. This destroyed one of the most sacred rights of an Englishman, the right to a trial by a jury of one's peers. To the colonists, this was a signal that they were no longer being treated as Englishmen. They were being treated like a conquered people in an occupied territory. This is the part that most people miss. The revolution wasn't just a political split, it was a psychological divorce. By ending salutary neglect, Britain forced the colonists to realize that they were different. For 100 years, the Americans had developed a culture of they were used to solving their own problems. When Britain returned to rule them, it was like a 30-year-old man being told by his father that he has a 7 p.m. curfew and is not allowed to manage his own bank account. The Americans didn't want to overthrow the government at first. They just wanted the ghosts to go back to being a ghost. They wanted their autonomy back. They wanted to be left alone. But the British didn't understand this. They saw the colonies as a resource to be managed, not a society to be respected. This fundamental misunderstanding, this clash of egos between a rising, independent-minded people and an old, detridden empire, is what truly set the stage for war. The taxes were the spark, but the end of neglect was the fuel. The Americans had tasted freedom for a century, and they weren't about to give up the keys to their own house without a fight. When we think of the economics of the revolution, we usually think of a group of angry guys shouting "No taxation without representation." It's a great slogan, but it's a bit like saying a divorce was only about a single credit card bill. The truth is far more complex and, frankly, far more devious. The American Revolution was triggered by a systemic, global economic war. Britain didn't just want a few pennies from a stamp or a crate of tea. They wanted to own the entire life cycle of American labor. To understand this, we have to look at the hidden machinery of the British Empire. Mercantilism, the mercantilist trap. You are a tool, not a trader in the 18th century. The British Empire didn't view the colonies as a partner or even as a country. They viewed the 13 colonies as a giant ATM and a raw material warehouse. Under the economic system of mercantilism, the goal of the empire was to hoard as much gold and silver as possible. To do this, they passed the Navigation Acts. These laws were the invisible chains on the American economy. They mandated that the colonies could only export their most valuable goods: tobacco, sugar, cotton, indigo dew. Britain. Imagine you're a tobacco farmer in Virginia. You spend all year sweating in the fields, battling pests and weather. You produce the finest tobacco in the world. A Dutch merchant sails into the Chesapeake Bay and offers you a premium price in gold for your crop. Under the law, you cannot sell to him. You are forced to put your tobacco on a British ship, send it to a British port, and sell it to a British middleman for whatever price they decide to give you. Then, that British middleman turns around and sells your tobacco to the Dutch for double the price, pocketing the profit. The colonists took 100% of the risk, but the British Empire took the lion's share of the reward. This wasn't trade, it was legalized plunder. The manufactured dependency, but the trap went deeper. Britain didn't just control what the colonists sold, they controlled what they were allowed to make. The British Parliament passed laws like the Wool Act, the Hat Act, and the Iron Act. These laws essentially told the Americans, you are allowed to dig iron out of the ground, but you are not allowed to build a factory to turn that iron into finished tools. You must ship the raw iron to England. Let our factories make the hammers and saws, and then buy them back from us at a massive markup. Britain wanted the colonies to remain an agrarian society, a collection of farmers who were forever dependent on London for everything from nails to fine clothing. They were intentionally stifling American industrialization. This created a trade deficit that was slowly draining the colonies of their hard currency. By the 1770s, many of the most famous founding fathers, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were buried in massive debt to British merchants. They weren't just fighting for liberty. They were fighting to escape a debt trap that the British legal system had designed to keep them subservient. The Tea Party myth. It wasn't tea. About high taxes, this brings us to the most misunderstood event in American history. The Boston Tea Party. If you ask the average person why the colonists threw the tea into the harbor, they'll say, because the tax was too high. Actually, the opposite is true. In 1773, the British East India Company, the biggest corporation in the world, was failing. It had millions of pounds of unsold tea sitting in London warehouses. To save the company, the British government passed the Tea Act. This act allowed the East India Company to sell its tea directly to the colonies, bypassing the colonial merchants and middlemen, even with the three-penny tax included. This tea was cheaper than the tea being smuggled in by American merchants. So, why? The anger. Why destroy millions of dollars worth of tea if it was cheaper? Because the Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly. The colonists realized that if the king could grant a monopoly on tea to his favorite corporation, he could do it for cloth, for bread, for wine, and for every other necessity of life. The Tea Party was a protest against corporate cronyism and the loss of a free market. The colonists saw the writing on the wall. If they accepted the cheap tea, they were accepting the king's right to control their entire economy. They chose to pay more for smuggled Dutch tea as a statement of economic independence. They were UN cheapskates. They were visionaries who realized that low prices are a trap if they come at the cost of your freedom to choose. The currency crisis. Printing their own future as. If the trade restrictions and monopolies weren't enough, Britain attacked the one thing that allowed the colonies to function. Their money. Because the colonists were constantly shipping their gold and silver to Britain to pay for manufactured goods, there was a massive shortage of real money in America. To keep their economies moving, the colonies began printing their own paper money. It worked brilliantly. It allowed farmers to trade and businesses to grow. But the British creditors in London hated it. They wanted to be paid in hard money gold, not scraps of paper. In 1764, Parliament passed the Currency Act, which banned the colonies from issuing their own money. This was an economic death blow. It caused a massive credit crunch, leading to bankruptcies and foreclosures across the 13 colonies. It was the 18th century equivalent of a government suddenly telling everyone that their bank accounts were frozen and their cash was worthless. The final tally. Why they fought when you added all up the navigation acts, the manufacturing bans, the monopolies, and the Currency Act. See a clear picture. The American Revolution was an economic jailbreak. The colonists weren't just upset about a few stamps on legal documents. They were looking at a future where they were permanent, second-class citizens in a global empire. They were the ones doing the work, clearing the land and building the towns. But the profits were all flowing back to a tiny island across the sea. They realized that as long as they were part of the British Empire, they would never be allowed to reach their full potential. They would never be allowed to have their own factories, their own banks, or their own trade routes. Independence wasn't just a political dream. It was an economic necessity. They didn't just want to be free men. They wanted to be owners. They wanted the right to the pursuit of happiness, which in the 18th century was code for the right to build wealth, own property, and trade freely with the world. The revolution was the moment the American businessman, the American farmer, and the American laborer all stood up together and said, "Our labor belongs to us." If the invisible line was the cage and the economic stranglehold was the chain, then the Enlightenment was the spark that taught the colonists how to pick the lock. We often talk about the revolution as a war of muskets and cannons, but the most dangerous weapons in the 1770s weren't made of iron, they were made of ink. Long before a single shot was fired at Lexington, a radical shift had occurred in the American mind. This was the Enlightenment virus, and once it infected the colonies, the old world of kings and subjects was doomed. The Great Awakening versus the Great Thinking to understand the American mind. You have to understand that these people were already primed for rebellion. In the mid-1700s, a religious movement called the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. It taught people that they didn't need a priest or a formal church hierarchy to talk to God. They could have a personal relationship with the divine. This was a massive, unspoken rehearsal for the revolution. If you don't need a bishop to tell you how to pray, why do you need a king to tell you how to live? But while the preachers were firing up the soul, the philosophers were firing up the brain. In the taverns of Boston and the libraries of Philadelphia, men were reading smuggled books by European thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These weren't just academic books. They were the blueprints for a new kind of human existence. John Locke and the Contract of Power, the most influential man in the American Revolution, was even alive in 1776. It was an Englishman named John Locke, who had died decades earlier. Before Locke, the world operated on a theory called the divine right of kings. The idea was simple. God chose the king. Therefore, the king's word was God's word. Disobeying the king wasn't just a crime. It was a sin. Locke flipped the table. He argued that every human being was born with natural rights that didn't come from a king, but from nature itself. He defined these as life, liberty, and property. Even more radical was Locke's social contract theory. He argued that government isn't a master, it's a servant. We, the people, only give the government power so that it can protect our rights. If the government fails to protect those rights or worse, starts violating them, the contract is broken. At that point, Locke argued, the people don't just have the right to overthrow the government, they have the obligation. Imagine being a colonial lawyer or a merchant, reading this by candlelight. Suddenly, your rebellion isn't treason anymore. It's a legal eviction of a bad tenant. The Enlightenment gave the colonists the moral high ground. They weren't outlaws. They were the enforcers of the laws of nature. Montesquieu and the fear of the one. Why Locke was giving them the reason to fight. A Frenchman named Baron de Montesquieu was giving them the structure of their future. Montesquieu looked at history and realized that whenever one person has all the power, they eventually become a tyrant. It's an inevitable law of human nature. His solution: separation of powers. The colonists became obsessed with this idea. They looked at the British system and saw the king, the parliament, and the courts all starting to bleed together into one giant, oppressive force. They realized that liberty wasn't just a feeling, it was a mechanical result of different parts of government constantly fighting and checking each other. This is why the colonists didn't just want better British rule. They wanted a system where no single person, no matter how good they seemed, could ever have total control again. They were designing a machine for freedom, the power of the printing press. 18th century social media ideas are only dangerous if they spread. And in the 1770s, the colonies had the most literate population in the world. While peasants in Europe were mostly illiterate and disconnected, American farmers were reading newspapers and pamphlets at an astonishing rate. The social media of the day were pamphlets. They were cheap, easy to hide, and written in plain English so everyone could understand them. The most famous of these was Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Paine didn't use fancy Latin or legal jargon. He spoke directly to the people. He called King George III a royal brute and argued that the idea of an island Britain ruling a continent America was as ridiculous as a moon trying to pull a planet. He wrote, "A government of our own is our natural right." Before Common Sense, many colonists were still on the fence. They were angry at the taxes, but they still loved the king. Paine's pamphlet was the virus that killed the last of their loyalty. It sold over 150,000 copies in a few months. the equivalent of a viral video with 1 billion views today. It moved the conversation from how do we fix the taxes to why do we even have a king? The tavern. The revolutionary think tank. You can talk about the Enlightenment without talking about the colonial tavern. In the 1700s, taverns weren't just places to get a drink. They were the internet of the colonies. It was where the mail was delivered, when newspapers were read aloud for those who couldn't read, and where the Enlightenment ideas were debated over ale. In places like the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston or City Tavern in Philadelphia, the common man, blacksmiths, sailors, and shopkeepers rubbed elbows with men like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. This was the first time in history that high-level political philosophy was being discussed by the working class. The Enlightenment virus jumped from the elite philosophers to the men who would actually have to carry the muskets. When a farmer at Lexington stood his ground against the British Army, he wasn't just thinking about a tax on his tea. He was thinking about his natural rights. He was thinking about his social contract. He was thinking about himself as a citizen, not a subject. The final transformation, the Enlightenment, changed the definition of legitimacy. Before this, a government was legitimate because it was old, because it was traditional, or because it was appointed by God. After the Enlightenment virus took hold, the colonists believed a government was only legitimate if it had the consent of the governed. This was a revolutionary idea that shifted the power from the throne to the town square. It turned a tax dispute into a crusade for the human soul. The British thought they were fighting a rebellion of mobs and rabble. They didn't realize they were fighting an army of people who had been intellectually reborn. The king could tax their tea. He could seize their land, and he could occupy their cities, but he could unteach them the idea that they were born free. Once the virus of the Enlightenment was in the blood of the American people, the only possible outcome was independence. By 1774, the atmosphere in the American colonies wasn't just tense, it was electric. The air felt heavy, like the moments right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. For a decade, the British and the Americans had been playing a dangerous game of chicken. But with the arrival of the coercive acts, the game ended. The British government stopped trying to manage the colonies and started trying to break them. This final chapter isn't just about the start of a war. It's about how 13 separate, bickering, and often competitive colonies, who usually hated each other as much as they hated the king, suddenly realized they were a single people. The intolerable mistaken response to the Boston Tea Party. King George III and the British Parliament were finished with diplomacy. They wanted to make an example out of Massachusetts. They passed a series of laws so harsh that the colonists renamed them the Intolerable Acts. First, they closed Boston Harbor. This was a death sentence for the city. Imagine New York or London today having their ports completely blocked by warships. No food coming in, no goods going out. Thousands of people lost their jobs overnight. Poverty and hunger began to creep through the streets of Boston. Second, they passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively abolished the colony's right to rule itself. Local officials were no longer elected. They were appointed by the king. Town meetings, the heartbeat of New England. The British thought this would starve the rebellion into submission. They thought the other colonies would look at Boston, get scared, and say, "Glad it's not us," and move on. They couldn't have been more wrong. The domino effect of empathy. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts acted as a massive magnet, pulling the colonies together, from Virginia to South Carolina. People began to think, if the king can take away the charter of Massachusetts today, he can take away the charter of Virginia tomorrow. If he can starve Boston, he can starve Charleston. This was the birth of colonial solidarity. Rice was sent from South Carolina to feed the hungry people of Boston. Flour was sent from Pennsylvania. Money was raised in the smallest villages of Connecticut. For the first time in history, the colonists stopped saying "I am a New Yorker" or "I am a Virginian" and started saying "I am an American." This shift in identity was the point of no return. You can negotiate with a disgruntled subject, but you cannot negotiate with a person who has decided they are part of a different nation. The First Continental Congress, the Shadow Government, September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia was late to the party, met in a humid hall in Philadelphia. This was the First Continental Congress. This wasn't a group of revolutionaries yet. Most of the men in that room, including George Washington and John Adams, were still hoping for a way to stay in the British Empire. But they were preparing for the worst. They Swed, a declaration of rights and grievances, and they did something even more radical. They formed the Continental Association. This was a total boycott of all British goods. No tea, no cloth, no tools, no luxury items. They even created committees of safety in every town to enforce the boycott. These committees were essentially a shadow government. They took over the roles of the British police and tax collectors. If you were caught buying British lace or drinking British tea, these committees would publicly shame you or worse. The ghost governance of the past was now being replaced by a homegrown American authority. The powder alarm, the search for the spark. While the politicians were talking in Philadelphia, the countryside was arming itself. In 1774 and early 1775, Massachusetts became a giant military camp. Farmers and shopkeepers began drilling on the town greens. They were the Minutemen, so named because they claimed they could be ready to fight in 60 seconds. The British military governor in Boston, General Thomas Gage, knew he was sitting on a powder keg. He received secret orders from London. Disarm the colonists. Gage knew that a rebellion without gunpowder is just a protest. He began sending redcoat expeditions into the countryside to seize colonial gunpowder magazines. One of these attempts, known as the powder alarm, almost started the war months early. Thousands of armed colonists swarmed toward Boston before realizing it was a false alarm. It was a dress rehearsal for the end of the world. The midnight ride and the shot heard round the war dawn. The night of April 18, 1775. General Gage finally made his move. He sent 700 elite British troops to march toward Concord to destroy a massive cache of colonial weapons and to arrest the ringleaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the Enlightenment virus had built a sophisticated spy network. Paul Revere and other writers galloped through the night, screaming that the regulars are coming out. When the sun rose on April 19th at Lexington Green, 77 Minutemen stood in the path of 700 of the world's best trained soldiers. Nobody knows who pulled the trigger first. But that single shot heard round the world didn't just kill a few men. It killed the British Empire's hold on America. By the time the British retreated back to Boston that evening, they had been harassed and shot at by thousands of colonists hiding behind trees and stone walls. The British lost nearly 300 men. The policing action had turned into a full-scale war. Conclusion: the real revolution, the American Revolution, is often taught as a story of a few battles and a final surrender at Yorktown. But the real revolution had already happened before the first musket ball was fired at Lexington. The revolution happened when the king drew a line in the dirt and told a free people they could move forward. It happened when the British tried to treat a mature self-sufficient society like a child's piggy bank. It happened when the ideas of natural rights became more important than royal traditions. The Boston Tea Party was just a symptom. The real causes were much deeper. A fight for land, a fight for the right to trade, and a fight for the right to think for oneself. The British thought they were fighting to keep 13 colonies. They didn't realize they were trying to stop a force of nature. A new identity had been forged in the fires of betrayal and economic pressure. The American was born, and no amount of redcoats, taxes, or tea could ever put that spirit back into a bottle.